It is the 11th of June, 1929, and on a stretch of shingle near Greatstone-on-Sea in Kent, a handful of men in flat caps and oilskins stand before a wall. Not a house wall, not a harbor wall, but something altogether stranger. A curved, concrete face, 200 feet long and 15 feet high, rising out of the flat marshland like the broken rim of some vast buried bowl. The wind off the channel cuts across the shingle. Somewhere out there, beyond the gray water, an airplane is climbing into the morning air, engine droning, on a course that nobody on the ground has yet seen. But one of the men standing at the foot of that vast curved wall is not looking at the sky. He is listening. Pressed to his ear is a stethoscope, its tubing running to a microphone mounted on a pole at the focal point of the concrete curve, a precise distance from the wall, calculated down to the inch. He turns his head, fractions of a degree at a time, hunting for the angle where the engine note swells loudest in his ears. When he finds it, he calls out a bearing. Somewhere behind him, a colleague notes the figure on a chart. The aircraft is still miles away. It cannot yet be seen with the naked eye, but it has already been heard, caught, and placed upon a map by a wall of concrete and a length of rubber tube. This is the sound mirror, and for the better part of 2 decades it represented Britain's best answer to a question that had begun to terrify its government. How do you defend an island when the sky itself has become an invasion route? The aeroplane had changed warfare faster than anyone in Whitehall could quite process. Channels and navies, the things that had kept Britain safe for centuries, meant nothing to a machine that could simply fly over them. And once a threat could come from the air, the old method of defense, watching the horizon with eyes and binoculars, was no longer good enough. You needed to know an aircraft was coming before it arrived close enough to see. You needed, in effect, to give the coastline ears. What makes this story remarkable is not that the sound mirrors won a war. They did not. Within a decade of that first successful test on the Kent coast, a quieter and far more capable technology would render every one of these concrete listening posts obsolete almost overnight. But the story of the sound mirror is the story of how Britain learned, the hard way, the lessons that would make radar possible at all, how to combine multiple observation points into a single picture, how to feed information from the coast to a command room, how to turn raw, ambiguous signals into a decision made in time to matter. Before there was a chain-home radar station, before there was a doubting system feeding plots into a room full of women moving counters across a map table, there was a man with a stethoscope, standing at the foot of a concrete wall in Kent, training his ear toward the sea. The problem that produced the sound mirror began in earnest during the First World War. From January 1915, German Zeppelins began crossing the North Sea to bomb English towns, and by 1917 the Zeppelins had been joined by Gotha bombers, heavier, faster aircraft capable of striking London directly. The raids killed hundreds of civilians and, just as importantly, they exposed how naked Britain's defenses truly were. Anti-aircraft guns existed, but they were largely useless if nobody could tell the gunners where to point them until the enemy was already overhead. Searchlights swept the sky, but a searchlight is only useful once you already know roughly where to look. The existing system of observation, men posted on rooftops and hillsides scanning the horizon, depended entirely on clear weather and daylight, and gave perhaps a minute or two of warning even under ideal conditions. Against an enemy that increasingly preferred to fly under cloud cover or at night, visual spotting was close to worthless. There was, however, a clue hiding in the noise itself. Aircraft engines of the period were loud, unsilenced, and distinctive, and sound travels through air at a fixed, predictable speed regardless of visibility. If you could not see the bomber, perhaps you could hear it, and if you could hear it from more than one position at once, perhaps you could calculate where it actually was. The principle was not new. Artillery sound ranging, working out the position of an enemy gun from the sound of its firing, had already been developed on the Western Front. And it was this same logic of multiple listeners taking simultaneous bearings and triangulating a fixed point that engineers now tried to turn skyward. The trouble was that an airplane's engine note is far fainter and far more diffuse than an artillery blast, and it does not arrive as a single sharp report but as a continuous low-droning hum, easily lost beneath the rustle of wind, the crash of surf, or simply the limits of unaided human hearing. Early experiments with handheld horns and trumpets, essentially oversized ear trumpets pointed at the sky, could pick up an approaching aircraft, but only at ranges too short to be of much practical use, often little more than the time it took to read a newspaper before the bombs began to fall. What was needed was a way to gather far more sound energy than the unaided human ear could manage, to focus it the way a lens focuses light, and to do so with enough precision that the resulting bearing was genuinely useful rather than a vague guess. Britain needed, in effect, to build an ear the size of a building, and somebody had to work out how. That somebody was Dr. William Sansom Tucker, a physicist who had cut his teeth on the very artillery sound-ranging techniques the Army had developed during the war, and who afterwards turned his expertise to the problem of detecting aircraft, eventually becoming the Air Ministry's Director of Acoustical Research. Working initially through experiments at sites including Biggin Hill, Tucker reasoned that the solution lay in the same physics that allows a satellite dish to gather a weak radio signal. A large, precisely curved concave surface will collect sound waves arriving from a particular direction and reflect them inward to converge at a single focal point. Build the curve correctly, place a sensitive microphone exactly at that focus, and you have, in effect, amplified the available sound many times over, simply through geometry rather than electronics. Tucker and his collaborators experimented with two broad families of design. The first were dish-shaped reflectors, shallow concrete bowls between roughly 6 and 9 meters across, not unlike a vastly oversized version of a satellite dish, with a microphone mounted on a slender pole at the focal point calculated from the curve's geometry. The second, more ambitious approach was the curved wall, a long, gently concave concrete face standing upright rather than lying flat, designed to gather sound across a wider arc of sky and concentrate it toward listening positions cut into the structure itself. The largest example of this second type, built at Denga on the Dungeness Peninsula in Kent and completed around 1930, stretched some 200 feet in length and stood roughly 15 feet high, a single unbroken sweep of curved concrete that, from a distance, resembles nothing so much as a fragment of some ancient amphitheater dropped onto the English coast. Its focal length, the calculated distance at which sound reflecting from every point on the curve would converge, was itself some 200 feet, meaning the listening position had to be set precisely that far back from the wall on its own dedicated platform. The construction itself was a substantial undertaking for what was, at heart, experimental military infrastructure. Concrete had to be poured in carefully calculated curved formwork, a task closer to civil engineering than ordinary building work, and the flat, low-lying terrain of Romney Marsh was chosen specifically because it offered clear, unobstructed sightlines towards the channel, and, crucially, relatively low ambient background noise away from rumbling traffic or industrial machinery that might drown out a faint and distant engine note. A small, dedicated railway spur was even laid to bring men, cement, and equipment out to the more remote sites. At the listening position, instead of relying purely on unaided human hearing, the system used sensitive microphones, hot wire designs that Tucker himself had a hand in refining, feeding through to headphones or stethoscope-style earpieces, allowing an operator to make finer adjustments than the ear alone ever could. By slowly rotating or adjusting his listening position and noting the angle at which the engine note reached its loudest and clearest point, the operator was, in effect, aiming the entire concrete structure like the world's largest and slowest gun sight, except what it was aiming at was sound rather than light. With 2 or more mirrors positioned at different points along the coast, each producing its own independent bearing toward the same aircraft. Those 2 lines could be plotted on a map, and where they crossed was, with reasonable accuracy, the aircraft's actual position, a technique directly inherited from the gun-ranging work of the previous war. By the late 1920s, this had become a genuine network rather than a scattering of experiments, with mirrors constructed along England's south and east coasts at locations including Hythe, Fan Bay near Dover, and the Dengie complex itself, which eventually held 3 separate designs side by side specifically so that researchers could compare their performance directly against one another. Under good conditions, the more capable mirrors could detect an approaching aircraft engine from somewhere between 8 and 20 miles out, with some claims for the largest structures stretching toward 25 miles in ideal, still air. It is worth pausing on what that figure actually meant in practice. Against an aircraft of the period cruising at perhaps 100 miles an hour, a detection range of 15 miles bought the defenders at best, something in the region of 9 or 10 minutes of warning. That is not a great deal of time, but set against the alternative, men squinting at an empty horizon, it represented a genuine and meaningful improvement, the difference between guns that might never fire a useful shot and guns that had at least some chance of being ready. If you are finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe really does help more than you might think. Documented operational use of the sound mirrors during the interwar years takes the form mostly of trials and exercises rather than wartime combat, and it is important to be honest about that distinction. These were, for most of their working life, experimental and developmental installations, tested during RAF air defense exercises in which friendly aircraft flew simulated approach patterns so that mirror crews could practice picking up bearings and feeding them through to a plotting room, refining the chain of command that would, in time, become essential to Britain's air defense as a whole. Some of the earlier, smaller horn-type listening devices, descended from the very first trumpet experiments of the First World War, did see limited genuine use against Zeppelin raids, though the surviving record of precisely how many interceptions or warnings can be credited to acoustic detection alone, as opposed to visual spotting working alongside it, is thin and often impossible to disentangle. What is clear is that the mirrors and their associated listening posts gave the RAF and Royal Observer Corps personnel of the period invaluable practical experience in something that mattered far more than any single detection: the discipline of taking a raw, ambiguous signal from a remote sensor, converting it into a bearing, and relaying that bearing fast enough to a central plotting table for it to be turned into a decision. Whatever the limitations of the technology itself, the procedures and personnel trained on the Kent coast did not vanish when the mirrors were abandoned. They were absorbed directly into the new radar chain that replaced them. It is also worth noting, with appropriate caution, the question of German awareness. Several historical accounts suggest that German planners were at least conscious of the possibility of acoustic detection along the English coast, and there has long been a theory, impossible to confirm with certainty from surviving records, that this is part of the reason German heavy bombers ran their twin engines deliberately unsynchronized rather than in the smoother, quieter synchronized mode that was otherwise standard practice. Whether this was a genuine countermeasure against sound mirrors specifically, or simply an engineering choice made for other reasons, remains a matter of historical debate rather than settled fact. Britain was not alone in pursuing this idea, and the comparison is instructive. In the Netherlands, engineers tested their own acoustic locating equipment at the Walsdorp Research Station, including imported designs from firms such as Geurds, but Dutch assessments concluded that several of these devices suffered fundamental deficiencies in practice. Japan developed an entirely separate family of acoustic locators, nicknamed war tubas by later observers, typically built from arrangements of large horns rather than concrete mirrors, with separate horns used to establish bearing and others to estimate altitude, an elegant but bulkier and less permanent solution than Britain's fixed concrete installations. The United States, too, experimented along broadly similar lines using portable horn arrays. What set the British program apart was less any single technical breakthrough and more its scale, its rigor, and its institutional backing, a dedicated Air Ministry research effort under a named physicist, a purpose-built experimental site at Dengue where competing designs could be tested side by side, and a deliberate effort to build the largest, most carefully engineered structures anywhere in this field, structures so distinctive that, even decades later, almost nothing else like them survives anywhere in the world. Germany, for its part, appears to have invested comparatively little in large-scale acoustic mirror infrastructure of this kind, a fact that becomes deeply ironic considering Germany would go on to develop its own radar technology, in some respects more advanced than Britain's, within little more than a decade. The historical impact of the sound mirror program is genuinely difficult to summarize in a single, satisfying sentence, and any honest account has to sit with that difficulty rather than smooth it away. As a weapon of detection in the war it was actually built to face, the Second World War, the sound mirror essentially never got the chance to prove itself, because by 1938, with war visibly approaching, an entirely different and far more capable technology had already begun to take its place. British scientists, led by Robert Watson Watt, had developed a system using radio waves rather than sound, what would become known as radar, and the resulting network of coastal stations, codenamed Chain Home, could detect approaching aircraft at well over 100 miles, 10 times the range of even the best acoustic mirror, and crucially, it worked regardless of wind direction, background noise, or whether the aircraft's engine happened to be running quietly. Against that kind of leap in capability, a wall of concrete, however cleverly shaped, simply could not compete, and the sound mirror program was largely abandoned mid-construction, its remaining unfinished structures left standing as Britain poured its resources into the radar chain instead. And yet, to call the sound mirrors a failure is to miss something important about how technological progress actually works. The methodology Tucker and his colleagues developed, of using multiple fixed observation points, converting raw sensor readings into bearings, and feeding those bearings into a central plotting system where they could be combined into a single coherent picture of the sky, was not thrown away when the mirrors themselves were abandoned. It was handed directly to the new radar effort, where it became the conceptual backbone of the Dowding system, the network that linked Chain Home's radar stations to a central operations room and from there to the fighter squadrons of the Royal Air Force. When the Battle of Britain came in the summer of 1940, the pilots who scrambled to meet incoming German raids did so because a chain of information, born on a marshy stretch of Kent coastline a decade earlier listening for engine noise through a stethoscope, had matured into something that could move information fast enough to win an actual war. The mirrors themselves never fired a shot and rarely, if ever, detected a genuine enemy raid under wartime conditions. But the habits of mind they instilled, the discipline of treating early warning as a system rather than a single clever device, arguably mattered just as much to Britain's survival as any individual piece of hardware. Several of these extraordinary structures still stand today, and they remain genuinely strange things to encounter in person. The Dengue complex on the Dungeness Peninsula preserves all three experimental designs side by side: the small 20-foot dish, the larger 30-foot dish with its surviving microphone mounting pole still visible at the center, and the immense 200-foot curved wall itself, now managed as a scheduled monument and accessible to visitors by guided tour. Further examples survive at Hythe, and a smaller wartime listening structure was rediscovered as recently as 2014 within the tunnels at Fan Bay near Dover. Beyond Kent, mirrors and remnants can still be found scattered along stretches of the English coastline at Hartlepool, Redcar, Sunderland, and elsewhere, weathered concrete curves standing in fields and on cliff tops, often passed by walkers who have no idea what they once were built to do. So return, for a moment, to that windswept stretch of shingle near Greatstone in 1929, to the man with the stethoscope pressed against his ear, turning his head by degrees, hunting the angle where an engine note rings clearest against 200 feet of curved concrete. He could not have known that within a decade his entire profession would be rendered obsolete by an invisible beam of radio energy traveling at the speed of light. He could not have known that the wall behind him, built with such care and at such expense, would stand unused and abandoned before it ever truly proved itself in the war it was designed for. What he could not see, but what history would eventually make clear, was that he was not really building a wall that listened. He was building the habit of listening, the procedures, the discipline, the chain of information from sensor to bearing to map to decision that Britain would need to survive what was coming. The concrete failed. The method did not. Long after the mirrors fell silent, the system they pioneered kept working, hidden inside a newer, faster, invisible technology, still doing exactly what Tucker had first asked of his curved walls on the Kent coast. Listen for the threat before it can be seen, and give Britain the few precious minutes it needs to be ready. That, in the end, is the real legacy standing on the shingle at Stanger. Not a machine that won a war, but an idea that taught a nation how to listen for one.